The island did not look like a battlefield. It sat off the coast of Northumbria, exposed to the North Sea, shaped by tide, wind, prayer, and routine. At Lindisfarne, the day could begin with cold air moving over the water, gulls above the rocks, and the quiet discipline of men who believed the world still had an order they understood. The monastery was not merely a cluster of buildings. It was a sacred memory made of timber, stone, manuscripts, relics, and human habit. It was tied to St. Cuthbert, to Northumbrian Christianity, to a world where holiness could sit near the edge of the sea and still feel protected by the invisible walls of reverence. Then, in 793, ships came out of that same sea. The sources do not give us a perfect scene. No chronicler stood above the shore with a camera. The details were later shaped by fear, grief, and religious interpretation. But the shock is not in doubt. Lindisfarne was attacked. A holy place was violated. Monks were killed or taken. Treasure and relics became prizes for men who had arrived from beyond the normal map of danger. To the people who heard the news, this was not just violence. It felt like a message from a broken world. Alcuin of York, writing from the world of Charlemagne's court, treated the attack as a spiritual wound. His response was filled with the language of sin, punishment, and divine warning. That was how many educated Christians understood disaster. Not first as logistics, not as naval strategy, but as a sign that heaven was angry and the moral order had cracked. That reaction matters. Because the first Viking raids did not only expose weak walls, they exposed weak imagination. Europe knew how to fear armies on roads, enemies across borders, rival kings, rebellious nobles, and raiders from nearby frontiers. But Lindisfarne revealed something more unsettling. The sea itself could become a road for violence. A monastery might own precious objects. It might preserve books. It might hold relics that gave a region identity and spiritual prestige. But none of that could stop a shallow draft ship from reaching a beach at the wrong hour. Somewhere inside the monastery, a monk may have heard the alarm before he understood it. Not a battlefield horn, not a royal messenger, perhaps only shouting, the drag of feet over wet ground, the hard sound of timber against shore, the sudden confusion of men who had spent their lives listening for bells and psalms, not oars and weapons. The air would have carried salt, smoke, damp wool, and fear. That kind of scene must be handled carefully. We should not invent his name. We should not pretend to know his final words. But we can understand the pressure of the moment. A religious community built for worship was being forced into a military reality it had never been designed to survive. The Viking advantage at Lindisfarne was not that they were more savage than everyone else in Europe. Violence was not rare in the 8th century. Kings blinded rivals, armies burned villages, nobles betrayed oaths. The difference was movement. The raiders could choose the point of contact. They could appear where political authority was slow, where defenses were thin, where wealth was portable, and where the cost of attack looked lower than the reward. A king might punish a raid after it happened. A local lord might gather men after the smoke had risen. But the raiders did not need to hold a battlefield long enough for the old rules to catch them. They needed only time to strike, load, and leave. This is why Lindisfarne became more than an atrocity in memory. It became an opening image for a new age of fear. The attack showed that wealth stored in sacred places could be turned into profit. That religious prestige did not guarantee military protection, and that the coast of a kingdom was not a border if ships could cross it faster than authority could respond. And the raiders learned too. They learned where treasure was kept. They learned how quickly news traveled. They learned which places were defended by soldiers and which were defended by trust. Every raid carried information back across the water. The shape of a coastline, the weakness of a river mouth, the habits of a monastery, the panic of a local ruler, the price a community might pay to recover captives or avoid another attack. This was not yet conquest. It was reconnaissance with axes. And here is the central paradox of the Viking Age. The men Europe first met as destroyers were not stepping into history as future kings. They came for silver, captives, status, and opportunity. They came because the sea made distance negotiable. They came because fragmented kingdoms and wealthy religious houses created a dangerous imbalance between value and defense. But success changes the people who succeed. A raid that works once becomes a story. A raid that works many times becomes a method. A method that gathers followers becomes a career. And a career built on violence eventually faces a question no raider can avoid forever. If the land is rich enough to attack again and again, why not stay close enough to control it? That question was not answered at Lindisfarne. Not yet. In 793, the image was still simple enough for frightened writers to understand. Heathen ships, Christian suffering, a holy island broken by men from the sea. The language of apocalypse came easily because the scene demanded it. If God's houses could be struck this way, what place was safe? But the deeper story was less simple. The Viking Age would not be only a story of burning monasteries. It would become a story of trade routes, winter camps, tribute payments, slave markets, treaties, baptisms, fortified towns, royal marriages, and tax systems. The first terror was the raid. The larger transformation came when raiders discovered that fear could open doors. Violence alone could not keep open. Lindisfarne was the wound Europe remembered. The lesson the raiders carried away was colder. The most valuable thing to steal was not gold. It was the right to rule. That right would take generations to seize. It would not come only through blades. It would require ships, silver, settlements, Christian legitimacy, local allies, and kings desperate enough to turn enemies into guardians. The men who first arrived as outsiders would in time learn the language of the societies they attacked. Some would become landholders. Some would become dukes. Some would become kings. Before we move into that transformation, hold on to the image of Lindisfarne, a holy island, a cold sea, and a community that realized too late that the horizon was not empty. If you want more stories where history is not treated as legend, but as a living system of power, follow the next chapter. Because the next part of this story is not about the axe. It is about the ship. The first machine that made Europe feel smaller. Before the Vikings could become rulers, they had to solve a simpler problem. They had to reach people before those people were ready. A longship on the shore did not need to look majestic to change history. It could sit half-pulled onto sand, its hull dark with tar, its planks overlapping in the clinker-built style, its oars stacked beside wet rope and sailcloth. To someone who understood it, the vessel was not just transport. It was strategy shaped into wood. The North Sea, the Baltic, the Irish Sea, the rivers of Francia, the channels into England. These were not empty spaces between kingdoms. To Scandinavian sailors, they were corridors. A coast was not the edge of the world. It was an opening. That was the first great advantage. The ship allowed movement without permission. A Frankish or Anglo-Saxon army depended on roads, supplies, horses, bridges, messengers, and visible preparation. Its movement left traces. Men had to be summoned. Food had to be gathered. Authority had to travel through known routes. A Viking fleet could cross water, appear at a shore, move up a river, strike a soft target, and leave before local power had finished understanding the threat. The longship did not make the Vikings invincible. Weather, hunger, resistance, and bad judgment could still destroy them. But it gave them something many European rulers did not possess in the same way: the ability to choose the time and place of danger. That choice was a form of power. Not power dressed in ceremony, not power written into law, not yet. It was power as a rival. The technology mattered because it changed the shape of fear. These ships could cross open water, but they could also enter shallow rivers and beach close to a target. They were light enough, flexible enough, and fast enough to make geography behave differently. A river that had carried trade, grain, fish, messages, and local travel could suddenly carry armed strangers deep into territory that did not think of itself as coastal. The sea had always been dangerous. Now the river was dangerous too. Imagine a shipwright in Scandinavia before a voyage. Not a king, not a saga hero, just a skilled man near timber, iron, wool, and tar. He shapes a plank with practiced hands. He checks the curve. He knows that a bad joint can become death far from home. Around him there is the smell of resin, damp wood, smoke from a nearby hearth, and iron being worked into rivets. Every decision is practical. The hull must be strong but not too heavy. The vessel must carry men but still move quickly. It must survive rough water and yet slide into places where larger ships would fail. The sail must take wind when the oars are not enough. The oars must answer when the wind disappears. This is where Viking violence begins to look less like chaos and more like engineering, not because the raiders were modern strategists. They were not. They lived inside a world of honor, kinship, competition, gods, chiefs, silver, revenge, and opportunity. But their raids were not random storms. They depended on tools, skill, timing, information, and repeated learning. A poor ship could not build an age. A good ship could make small groups feel larger than they were. That mattered in the late 8th and 9th centuries because Europe was rich enough to attract attack and divided enough to struggle against it. Monasteries held portable wealth. Coastal settlements stored goods. Royal authority was often local, slow, or politically distracted. In the world after the early Carolingian expansions, and especially as power fragmented across regions, defense was rarely as quick as the threat. The Vikings did not need to defeat all of Europe. They needed to find the places where Europe was late. The pattern repeated because the reward justified the risk. One raid brought silver, captives, prestige, weapons, stories, and the ability to attract more men. A leader who returned with wealth did not merely become richer. He became more persuasive. Followers gathered where success had already been proven. Ships made violence mobile. Success made it contagious. This was not only about greed, though greed was there. It was also about status. In societies where reputation mattered deeply, a voyage could change a man's standing. A young warrior could return with arm rings, foreign coins, a captive, a weapon, or simply a story that placed him closer to power. A chief could reward men from the silver he acquired abroad. A household could be strengthened by wealth taken far from home. Movement created opportunity. Opportunity created loyalty. Loyalty created larger expeditions. That is why the longship should not be treated as background decoration. Without it, Lindisfarne remains a local tragedy. With it, Lindisfarne becomes a pattern that can move from Northumbria to Ireland, from the Irish Sea to the Seine, from the Channel to the Thames, from coastal fear to inland panic. By the 9th century, Viking pressure was felt across multiple zones. In Ireland, Scandinavian activity helped create and transform coastal power centres, including Dublin. In Francia, rivers like the Seine became routes of repeated attack. In England, the Thames and other waterways made the interior more exposed than any ruler wanted to admit. Farther east, river systems would help connect Scandinavian adventurers and traders to the Volga, the Dnieper, the Islamic world, and Byzantium. The same basic logic kept appearing in different forms. Water carried the threat. Local authority had to chase it, and chasing was expensive. A king could order defenses after a raid, but the coastline was long and the treasury was finite. A local lord could fortify one settlement, but the raiders might choose another. A monastery could move relics, hide treasure, or pray for protection. But prayer did not make the tide less useful to men with oars. This imbalance forced European rulers into bad choices. They could fight and risk defeat. They could pay and invite return. They could fortify and burden their people with labor. They could negotiate with men they despised. None of these options was clean, because the ship had made old categories unstable. Was the enemy outside the kingdom if he could arrive anywhere? Was a border still a border if it floated? The Viking ship also carried something less visible than warriors: information. Every coastline studied, every river tested, every monastery attacked, every payment extracted became part of a growing mental map. The raiders learned where wealth sat, where resistance formed quickly, where rulers were divided, where winter shelter could be found, where captives could be sold, where silver could be weighed. Europe saw pirates. The Vikings were also collecting geography. That did not mean they were united. There was no single Viking empire directing all these movements. The word Viking itself describes activity more than a nationality in the modern sense. Danes, Norwegians, Swedes, and other Scandinavian groups moved in different directions for different reasons. Some raided, some traded, some settled, some served as mercenaries, some became rulers. Many did several of those things in one lifetime or across generations. The ship made that flexibility possible. It could carry an axe toward a monastery one year and goods toward a market another. It could carry a raiding party, a trading crew, a diplomatic mission, settlers, slaves, silver, furs, weapons, amber, and news. The line between violence and commerce was not always clean because the same route could support both. A merchant who knew a harbor might also know its defenses. A raider who took silver might later return to trade. A war leader who terrified a coast might eventually want land on that same coast. The longship did not decide those futures by itself. Men made those decisions. Chiefs took risks. Kings responded. Communities adapted. But the vessel created the conditions in which those decisions became possible at a speed Europe was not prepared to match. This is why the Viking Age cannot be understood only by looking at swords. The sword mattered in the moment of contact. The ship mattered before and after, before the raid, because it made arrival possible. after the raid because it made escape, return, and repetition possible. A sword could kill a guard. A ship could make an entire coastline feel permanently uncertain. For rulers, uncertainty was poison. A kingdom depends on the belief that authority can protect, punish, and respond. When raids came from the sea and vanished back into it, that belief weakened. People still owed loyalty. They still paid dues. They still looked to kings, lords, bishops, and local elites. But each successful raid asked a silent question. What is protection worth if danger moves faster than command? The answer would not come immediately. It would take walls, fleets, fortified towns, tribute systems, treaties, and new forms of kingship. It would force rulers like Alfred of Wessex to think not only like warriors, but like organizers. It would push Frankish kings into deals that turned enemies into frontier lords. It would help Viking leaders discover that speed could win wealth, but land required a different skill. For now, the ship was enough. It carried men across cold water. It carried fear into places that had mistaken distance for safety. It turned rivers into roads, shores into targets, and scattered war bands into forces that could gather, strike, vanish, and return with better knowledge than before. Before the Vikings ruled kingdoms, they ruled the distance between them. That was the first stage of the transformation. Not a throne, not a crown, a hull in the water, a sail in the wind, and a coastline that no longer knew when it was safe. But movement alone could not build power forever. A ship could bring raiders to wealth, but it could not explain why they kept coming back, why larger forces gathered, why some leaders became more than seasonal predators. For that, the next chapter must follow the silver. The sea brought the Vikings to Europe. Silver gave them a reason to return. In the early raids, the reward had to be portable. A war band could not easily carry away fields, walls, or villages. It could not pack a kingdom into a ship. What it could take were things that moved well: coins, ornaments, chalices, weapons, livestock, captives, and anything that could be cut, weighed, traded, melted, ransomed, or displayed. That is why monasteries and wealthy coastal settlements mattered so much. They were not simply spiritual centers or local communities. They were storage points for concentrated value. A jeweled reliquary, a silver cup, a decorated book cover, a small chest of coins. These were not only sacred objects to the people who owned them. To raiders looking across a cold sea, they were wealth that could fit into a hull. The Vikings did not invent the violence of plunder. Europe already knew that language. What made the Viking raid so destabilizing was the way plunder became mobile, repeatable, and increasingly connected to wider networks of exchange. A raid was not finished when the ships left the shore. The wealth had to be divided. Captives had to be moved. Silver had to be weighed. Leaders had to reward followers. Goods had to enter markets. Reputation had to be converted into loyalty. In that process, violence began to acquire accounting. A piece of silver could be hacked apart and weighed. Arm rings could be cut. Coins from far beyond northern Europe could appear in Scandinavian hoards. Islamic dirhams moved through eastern trade routes, reaching the Baltic and Scandinavia through networks that connected the Volga, the Caspian world, and markets far beyond the imagination of many people living on the Atlantic coasts being raided. The result was not a simple line between raider and merchant. It was a world where the same man, or the same family, or the same network might understand both. One season could bring violence. Another could bring trade. A ship that carried armed men toward a monastery could later carry furs, amber, slaves, silver, or news toward a market. The difference between commerce and coercion was often decided by opportunity. In Ireland, Scandinavian activity helped transform Dublin into one of the most important Viking centres. By the mid-9th century, it was not merely a raiding base. It became part of a wider maritime economy tied to warfare, settlement, craft production, trade, and the traffic in human beings. That last part must not be softened. Captivity was central to the violence of the age. People were taken in raids not only to terrify communities, but because human bodies had value in exchange systems. Some captives were ransomed. Some were enslaved. Some were moved across water and sold far from the places where they had been seized. For the raiders, captives were wealth. For the communities attacked, they were sons, daughters, monks, servants, farmers, craftsmen, and children pulled out of the protection of ordinary life. A small scene can show the system better than a battlefield. Imagine a trading place near smoke, mud, wet timber, and voices speaking more than one tongue. A merchant weighs silver on a small balance. The metal is not pure storybook treasure. It is practical. Chopped, bent, marked by use, valued by weight, more than by the authority stamped on it. Nearby, captives wait under guard. A rope cuts into a wrist. A cloak is damp from rain. Someone coughs from the cold. No one has to announce that this is politics, but it is, because a leader who controls silver can reward men. A leader who rewards men can gather a larger following. A larger following can take greater risks. Greater risks can bring greater returns. This is how a successful raid stops being an isolated act and becomes a career path for ambitious men living on the edge of opportunity. The raider needed courage, but courage alone was not enough. He needed a ship, a crew, information, a target, a market, and a way to turn stolen value into social power at home. Silver was useful because it could travel across cultural boundaries. It did not matter whether the man weighing it worshipped Christ, Odin, or something else. Metal had a language of its own. This helped Viking leaders build authority before they had kingdoms. In Scandinavia, wealth from abroad could strengthen a household, elevate a chieftain, finance followers, buy alliances, and decorate the body with proof of success. An arm ring was not merely ornament. It could be a payment, a symbol of loyalty, a visible reminder that a leader had access to distant wealth. Success at sea could become influence on land. That influence created competition. If one leader returned rich, others noticed. If one crew gained silver, another crew wanted its own share. If one route produced profit, the route would be tested again. This did not require a single master plan. It required repeated examples of reward. Europe's weakness became part of Scandinavian ambition. At the same time, Europe's response often made the system stronger. When rulers or communities paid to make raiders leave, they were not being foolish. Payment could be rational in the moment. A sack of silver might be cheaper than a burned town, a ruined harvest, a destroyed monastery, or another round of captives taken away by ship. But payment taught a lesson. It showed that fear itself could be monetized. A raid could produce wealth through looting. The threat of a raid could produce wealth through tribute. In some cases, violence did not even need to be completed if the possibility of violence was credible enough. That was dangerous. Because a successful tribute payment did not always end the problem. It could prove that the target was worth returning to. It could tell other leaders that this king, bishop, town, or region had both wealth and vulnerability. The payment solved one emergency while feeding the logic that created the next. In Francia, repeated Viking pressure along rivers like the Seine exposed this pattern with brutal clarity. A fleet could move inland, threaten towns, disrupt royal authority, and force negotiation. Kings could fight when they had the strength, but political fragmentation made consistent defense difficult. Local communities often paid the price for decisions made far away. The same tension appeared in England and Ireland in different forms. Wealth drew raiders. Repeated raids created more knowledge. More knowledge made raids more efficient. Efficiency attracted larger forces. Larger forces eventually needed more than loot. They needed places to stay. That is the turning point hidden inside the silver economy. At first, portable wealth made movement attractive, but as expeditions grew, as leaders accumulated followers, as raiding seasons stretched longer, mobility itself created demands. Men needed food, shelter, repair, horses, intelligence, trading contacts, and local arrangements. A fleet was fast, but it was not weightless. Every warrior had to eat. Every ship had to be maintained. Every hostage or captive had to be guarded. Every winter raised the question of where the warband would survive until the next opportunity. The economics of terror began to push the Vikings toward territory. Not because every raider dreamed of becoming a king. Many did not. Some wanted wealth, fame, revenge, adventure, status, or survival. Some probably wanted only a profitable season and a safe return. But the structure of success created pressure beyond individual desire. If raiding worked, more men came. If more men came, more supplies were needed. If supplies were needed, local land mattered. And once land mattered, the raider was no longer thinking only about what he could carry away. He was thinking about what he could control. The raid was becoming an economy, and every economy eventually asks who has the right to govern it. That right was still uncertain. In the 9th century, many Viking groups remained outsiders, feared and condemned in Christian writing. They could be described as heathens, pirates, wolves, punishments from God. Some of those descriptions reveal genuine suffering. Others reveal the limits of the people writing them. A monk who saw his community attacked had no obligation to admire the logistical intelligence of his attackers. But beneath the moral language, a harder reality was forming. The Vikings were learning how European wealth moved. They were learning which rivers mattered, which kings were weak, which towns could pay, which captives could be sold, which markets were useful, and which regions might support a longer presence. They were not yet rulers in the full sense. They did not yet hold the legal and religious machinery that made authority durable. Still, silver was teaching them the first lesson of power. Taking wealth is temporary. Controlling the conditions that produce wealth is different. This is why the next stage of the Viking Age would be more frightening than the first. A raid could burn and disappear. A trader could arrive and depart. A tribute demand could pass like a storm. But when armed men stopped leaving at the end of the season, when they built camps, took supplies, negotiated with local powers, and waited through winter, the meaning of their presence changed. The coast had already learned to fear the ship. Now the land would learn to fear the campfire that did not go out. A raid was supposed to end. That was part of its terror, but also part of its limit. Ships appeared, violence struck, wealth disappeared, and then the horizon swallowed the attackers again. Communities could bury the dead, repair what could be repaired, move relics, count losses, and wait for the next season with dread. But a camp was different. A camp meant smoke rising where smoke should not rise. It meant armed men remaining after the first shock had passed. It meant stolen animals kept alive, tools repaired, fires fed, captives guarded, blades sharpened, and wet cloaks hung near shelters, while local people watched the strangers settle into the landscape. The Viking Age changed when raiders began to winter near the places they had once only attacked. This was not a clean transformation. There was no single morning when every raider became a settler or every warband decided to build a kingdom. The shift happened unevenly across different coasts and rivers, shaped by opportunity, resistance, weather, food, and political weakness. But by the mid-9th century, Viking forces were no longer only seasonal visitors. In Ireland, Francia, and England, fortified bases and winter camps gave their violence a new weight. They were no longer just arriving. They were remaining. The difference sounds simple, but politically it was enormous. A raiding fleet that left could be remembered as disaster. A force that stayed became a daily problem. It had to eat. It had to be watched. It needed horses, timber, metalwork, shelter, intelligence, and sometimes negotiation. It created pressure not only at the moment of attack, but through the long, cold months when local food stores were already under strain. Imagine a farmer near a river in Francia or England after an army has settled for the winter. He does not need to understand grand strategy. He sees the problem in smaller terms. Fewer animals in the enclosure, men moving through muddy fields, smoke from unfamiliar fires, the sound of axes cutting wood that was not theirs, and the knowledge that spring might not bring relief. His world has changed without a treaty. The king may still be king. The bishop may still pray. The local lord may still speak of order. But near the camp, order is what armed men can enforce before sunset. This is why wintering mattered so much. It turned the Viking presence from an event into a condition. A raid belonged to a day or a week. A camp belonged to a season. And once violence lasted through seasons, it began to shape politics around it. Local rulers faced choices with no clean answer. They could attack and risk failure. They could pay and hope the army moved elsewhere. They could make agreements and appear weak. They could try to starve the invaders out if the invaders had not already seized enough food. Every option carried a cost, and the cost was rarely paid only by kings. Villagers paid in grain, farmers paid in livestock, families paid in fear. The camp exposed something the raid had only suggested. Viking power was becoming logistical. To keep men together, a leader needed more than courage. He needed supplies. He needed discipline, or at least enough authority to stop his own followers from dissolving. He needed local knowledge. He needed a way to turn violence into continuity. Continuity is where politics begins. In the 850s and 860s, this pressure became harder for European kingdoms to ignore. Viking forces established bases, returned to known routes, and learned how to exploit rivalries among local rulers. Along the Seine, the Loire, and other river systems, Frankish lands faced repeated attacks that revealed both wealth and fragmentation. In the British Isles, Viking activity in Ireland and England increasingly involved not only raiding, but holding positions, controlling access, and using bases as platforms for further action. The camp also changed the raiders themselves. A man who spends a few days plundering a coast can remain outside the society he attacks. A man who spends months near its fields, roads, markets, rivers, and churches learns more. He learns who hates whom. He learns which lord is desperate, which town can pay, which road is used for supplies, which river bend hides a landing place, which local elites might negotiate if the alternative is worse. Staying creates intelligence. It also creates appetite. Because once a warband has lived from a region, the idea of simply leaving with portable wealth may begin to feel incomplete. If the land feeds men through winter, if the rivers carry ships inland, if towns can be threatened repeatedly, if local rulers can be forced to pay, then the region is not only a target, it is a resource system. That word sounds cold because the reality was cold. For the people living under that pressure, Viking strategy was not an abstract mechanism. It arrived as requisitioned food, missing cattle, damaged barns, hostage-taking, ransom demands, ruined religious houses, and rumors moving faster than official messages. A winter camp did not have to conquer a whole kingdom to make ordinary life feel occupied. This is where the older political order struggled. Many early medieval rulers could raise armies, but they could not always keep them in the field indefinitely. Their authority depended on local obligations, noble cooperation, seasonal rhythms, and the ability to respond to threats that could be identified clearly. Viking forces made that harder. They moved between raiding, trading, negotiating, and camping. They did not always offer a single front line. A king might defend one city while another river mouth was tested. A lord might protect his estate while a monastery nearby was stripped. A community might pay for peace while its neighbor became the next target. This unevenness made fear spread beyond the actual reach of any one fleet. People did not need to see the ships to live under the possibility of them. News traveled through merchants, monks, refugees, sailors, and messengers. Every report added to a wider knowledge that something had changed along the water routes of Europe. The raiders were not ghosts. They were men with hunger, ambition, rivalries, and practical needs. That made them more dangerous, not less. A supernatural enemy can be cursed from a pulpit. A hungry army must be fed, fought, paid, redirected, or settled. European rulers often chose payment or negotiation because immediate survival demanded it. Later storytellers sometimes treat tribute as cowardice, but the reality was harsher. If a ruler lacked the forces to defeat a Viking army in that moment, payment might preserve lives, churches, towns, harvests, and political breathing room. It was not always weakness. Sometimes it was triage, but triage can become dependency. If payment worked once, the logic could return. If land was granted to stop violence, that too could become a model. If a leader discovered that a ruler would rather negotiate than fight, negotiation itself became another field of combat. This is how winter camps helped move Viking power towards settlement. Not because every camp became a town, not because every raider suddenly desired law courts and farms, but because staying created relationships with land, supplies, local rulers, and local populations. It forced both sides to think beyond the moment of attack. A fleet could leave with silver. An army that stayed began asking different questions. Where will the horses come from? Who controls the river? Which settlement can provide food? Which ruler can be pressured? Which church has wealth? Which local rival might prefer our presence to his enemy's rule? Which fields are worth holding through winter? Those questions were not yet statecraft in a formal sense. But they were moving in that direction. By 865, the logic of staying reached England with devastating force. The Great Army did not behave like a passing raid. It arrived as a sustained military presence, able to move, pressure, occupy, take horses, exploit divisions, and break kingdoms one by one. East Anglia, Northumbria, Mercia, and finally, Wessex would face a form of Viking warfare that had grown beyond coastal shock. The English were not facing a storm anymore. They were facing weather that had learned to stay. That was the real danger of the winter camp. It made Viking violence less like a wound and more like a climate. It stayed long enough for people to adapt around it, fear it, bargain with it, profit from it, and sometimes join it. It created spaces where raiders could become neighbors, enemies could become landlords, and temporary occupation could harden into political fact. The moment the Vikings stopped leaving, Europe stopped dealing with raids and started dealing with power. That power still needed form. It needed leaders capable of holding men together. It needed routes, supplies, horses, and targets. It needed fractured enemies. It needed cities worth taking and kingdoms too divided to resist together. England would provide all of that. The next chapter begins when the camp becomes an army, and the army begins to break a kingdom from the inside out. The ships no longer came like a passing knife. They came like a decision. In 865, a large Viking force arrived in England, remembered in later tradition as the Great Army, or, in the language of hostile Christian chroniclers, the Great Heathen Army. The name carries fear inside it, but fear can blur as much as it reveals. This was not a single nation moving under one flag in the modern sense. It was a coalition of Scandinavian war leaders, followers, ships, ambitions, grudges, hunger, and opportunity. What made it different was not simply size, it was duration. Earlier raids had taught Europe to fear sudden arrival. Winter camps had taught rulers that raiders could stay through the season. The Great Army brought these lessons together and turned them against the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms with a new level of pressure. It did not merely strike and vanish. It moved, occupied, demanded, negotiated, took horses, tested alliances, and exploited the fact that England was not one united state. England at this moment was a map of kingdoms. Northumbria in the north, Mercia in the Midlands, East Anglia in the east, Wessex in the south. Their rulers shared language, Christian culture, and certain political assumptions. But they also had rivalries, local interests, dynastic tensions, and uneven military strength. A danger that could move quickly between them did not need to defeat a single English army at the beginning. It could break the system in pieces. The army first found support and supplies in East Anglia. According to the broad outline preserved in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, the Vikings were given horses there, whether by force, negotiation, fear, or political calculation. The details are not fully recoverable. What matters is the consequence. Men who had arrived by ship could now move inland with greater speed and reach. This was an important shift. A raider with a ship threatens a coast and a river. A raider with horses threatens the roads between political centers. He becomes harder to contain, harder to predict, and harder to starve in place. The Great Army was not abandoning maritime power. It was adding land mobility to it. The result was a new kind of pressure on England. In 866, the army moved north and took York, one of the most important cities in Northumbria. York had Roman roots, Christian importance, political value, and commercial potential. It was not just a prize for looting, it was a position. From there, Scandinavian power could anchor itself in the north, and over time the city would become known in a Norse-influenced form as Jorvik. The fall of York exposed the danger of internal division. Northumbria was already politically unstable, with rival claimants and factional tension. The Vikings did not need to invent weakness there. They needed to use it. A divided kingdom facing a mobile, aggressive army is not merely unlucky. It becomes readable to its enemies. A city under new rule does not stop being a city. That is one reason conquest can become more powerful than destruction. After the fighting, markets still need bread. Craftsmen still need customers. Traders still ask what roads are safe. Families still look for protection, even if protection now comes from men whose language sounds unfamiliar in the street. Imagine a craftsman in York opening his stall after the shock of conquest. The timber shutters creak. Smoke hangs low from hearths. Mud clings to boots in the street. He hears voices he knows and voices he does not. Coins still pass from hand to hand. Tools still need repair. Leather still needs cutting. Iron still needs working. But above daily life hangs a new fact. The men who control violence now control the rhythm of trade. This is where the Vikings began to change the meaning of victory. If they destroyed a monastery, they gained wealth. If they held a city, they gained position. York gave them more than plunder. It gave them a base, a market, a political symbol, and a doorway into the land around it. The army could move from there with greater confidence, and local communities had to adjust to the reality that Viking power was no longer something that always sailed away. The consequences spread. Northumbria was broken. East Anglia would later suffer devastating pressure. Mercia would be forced into submission and partition. Wessex would become the last major Anglo-Saxon kingdom capable of sustained resistance. This was not a simple line of inevitable Viking triumph, but the direction of danger was clear. The Great Army did not have to govern England immediately to make English politics revolve around it. Every kingdom now had to ask the same question. Could it fight alone and survive? The answer was usually uncertain, and uncertainty favors the force already moving. The Viking commanders associated with this period, names like Ivar, Halfdan, Uppa, and others in later sources, are difficult to separate cleanly from chronicle, memory, and saga tradition. Some were certainly real actors in the broad political military world of the Great Army. Some stories around them were sharpened over time. A serious documentary should not pretend that legend is the same as evidence. But the structure of events is clear enough. The army was able to apply pressure across multiple kingdoms, because those kingdoms were not coordinated enough to absorb the shock together. When one region was struck, another might hesitate. When one ruler paid, another might fight. When one dynasty was weakened, local rivals might see opportunity. The Vikings were not only attacking walls and armies, they were attacking the gaps between political communities. Those gaps were wide. In 869, East Anglia was overrun, and King Edmund was killed. Later Christian tradition would remember him as a martyr, and the stories of his death became part of English religious memory. The exact details are wrapped in hagiography and later storytelling, but his political defeat was real. Another kingdom had been forced into the Viking orbit, and the moral language of martyrdom could not undo the military result. Mercia, once one of the most powerful Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, also came under crushing pressure. The Great Army's campaigns contributed to the weakening and division of Mercian authority. In time, part of Mercia would fall under Viking control, while another part survived under rulers dependent on Wessex. Again, the lesson was not merely that Vikings could win battles. It was that sustained military pressure could rearrange political dependency. The map was changing, not all at once, and not neatly, but enough. This is the part of the Viking Age where the word raider begins to feel too small. A raider takes, an army compels, a ruler rearranges. The Great Army was not yet a stable government, but it forced governments to react as if a new political force had entered the room and refused to leave. Its power rested on several mechanisms working together. Ships brought the army into England. Horses expanded its range. Previous raids had provided knowledge. English divisions gave openings, captured or negotiated supplies, kept men moving. Cities and camps provided bases. Fear made payment possible. Victory attracted more men, or at least strengthened the authority of successful leaders. None of these mechanisms was magical. Together, they were dangerous. For ordinary people, the difference between a raid and an army was measured in repetition. A raid might take a relative, a cup, a chest, an animal, a life. An army could change who collected dues, who controlled roads, whose law mattered, which lord could protect a village, whether a market reopened, whether a church was safe, and whether the next harvest would feed the local community or armed strangers. That is how conquest enters daily life, not first as a line in a chronicle, but as a change in who can demand obedience. By the late 870s, the pressure had reached Wessex. Alfred, later called the Great, did not inherit a calm world. He faced an enemy that had already shown it could destroy kingdoms and exploit hesitation. Wessex had to confront the possibility that it might become the next name in a list of broken powers. But Alfred's importance lies partly in the fact that he understood the war could not be answered by courage alone. Heroic resistance sounds clean in memory. In practice, survival required organization. Fortified places, coordinated response, negotiated settlement when necessary, and the ability to turn scattered defense into a system. The Great Army had taught England a cruel lesson before Alfred could answer it. A kingdom does not fall only when its king is defeated. It begins to fall when its enemies understand its divisions better than its rulers do. That was the wound opened by the Viking campaigns of the 860s and 870s. Northumbria, East Anglia, and Mercia did not simply vanish into darkness, but their old independence was broken or transformed. York became a Scandinavian centre. The eastern and northern parts of England moved toward the world that would later be called the Danelaw. Wessex stood exposed, not because it was weak in every way, but because so much around it had already shifted. The Vikings had crossed a threshold. They had moved from coastal terror to territorial politics, from raiding houses of God to reshaping the fate of kings. Yet their success also created a new problem. The more land they influenced, the more resistance adapted. The more they stayed, the more they needed food, agreements, boundaries, and legitimacy. The more they broke, the more they had to decide what they intended to build. Wessex would force that question into the open. The next chapter begins not with a Viking victory, but with an English king learning that survival required walls, oaths, and time. Wessex did not survive because it was untouched. It survived because it learned under pressure. By the late 870s, The Viking armies had already changed England's political landscape. Northumbria had been broken. East Anglia had been overrun. Mercia had been forced into submission and division. York was no longer simply an old northern city inside an Anglo-Saxon world. It had become a Scandinavian center of gravity. Wessex was not watching this from safety. It was next. Alfred, King of Wessex, inherited a war that could not be solved by one heroic charge. The danger he faced was mobile, experienced, and patient enough to exploit hesitation. The Viking army did not need to behave like a conventional enemy. It could move through seasons, force payments, take supplies, use horses, and turn local weakness into strategic advantage. The old rhythm of kingship was not enough. A king could still summon men. He could still lead an army. He could still pray, issue commands, reward loyalty, punish betrayal, and claim divine favor. But the question now was practical. Could authority arrive fast enough to matter? That was the problem Alfred had to solve. The crisis reached its most dangerous point in 878, when Guthrum and his forces struck Wessex with devastating force. Alfred was driven into a desperate position, remembered in tradition through his refuge in the marshes around Athelney. Later stories would decorate this period with legend, including the famous tale of the burnt cakes. That story may reveal more about memory than fact. What matters historically is the condition behind it. The King of Wessex had been pushed close to the edge. For a moment, Wessex looked breakable. Not symbolically, materially. A king without secure territory is not much more than a claim with followers. Alfred still had supporters, but the Viking pressure had shown how quickly royal authority could shrink when it lost roads, towns, food, and confidence. Survival required him to gather men, choose his moment, and reassert force before Wessex became another conquered name. The moment came at Edington in 878. Alfred defeated Guthrum's army. The battle did not erase Viking power from England, and it did not restore the old world. But it gave Wessex breathing room. It proved that the great army could be beaten in the field under the right conditions. More importantly, it allowed Alfred to turn a military victory into a political settlement. Guthrum was baptized, with Alfred acting as sponsor. This was not just a religious gesture in the private modern sense. Baptism was political language. It gave the defeated Viking leader a place inside a Christian order that Anglo-Saxon rulers could recognize. It did not make every conflict disappear. It did not remove suspicion, but it changed the terms by which Guthrum could rule and by which Alfred could claim that the crisis had been contained rather than merely postponed. A sword had created the emergency. A ritual helped make the settlement speakable. In the years after Edington, the relationship between Wessex and Viking-controlled territories took clearer shape. The exact chronology of agreements must be handled carefully. The so-called Peace of Wedmore is known mainly through later narrative tradition, while the surviving treaty of Alfred and Guthrum is often associated with the broader settlement that followed. What matters for the story is the political reality. England was no longer divided only by battlefield outcomes, but by negotiated boundaries, legal expectations, and zones of authority. This was the world that would later be described through the idea of the Danelaw. For Alfred, that settlement was not pure triumph. It was a compromise forced by reality. He could not simply wish Viking power away. He had to define it, contain it, and build against it. That required a different kind of kingship, less glorious in poetry, but more durable in practice? The answer was organization. Wessex needed fortified places that could slow raids, shelter people, guard roads, and provide points of response. These burhs, fortified towns or strongholds, became central to Alfred's defensive vision. Not every detail can be placed neatly into 1 year, and later evidence such as the Burgal Hiddage reflects a developing system. But the direction is clear. Wessex began to make defense more structured, more local, and less dependent on one panicked royal response after disaster. A fortified place is not just a wall, it is labor. Someone has to cut timber, dig earth, carry stone, repair gates, watch approaches, store supplies, and leave normal work behind when danger comes. The burden of defense falls into ordinary hands. A king can order a fortification, but the body of the system is made by men whose names rarely survive. Imagine one of them at a burh under grey weather. His hands are raw from hauling timber. Mud sticks to his legs. Smoke from cooking fires hangs low inside the defenses. Nearby, someone checks a gate hinge. Someone else stacks tools under a shelter before rain returns. He may not think of himself as part of a grand reform. He knows only that the old way failed too often, and now his labor is being turned into the line between his home and the next army. This is what adaptation looked like. Not only kings and battles, but splinters, ditches, sweat, wet wool, and the slow conversion of fear into infrastructure. Alfred's military reforms also aimed at time. Time had been one of the Vikings' greatest advantages. They could arrive quickly and exploit the delay before resistance gathered. Fortified networks and reorganized obligations changed that equation. If people had refuge nearby, if forces could assemble more predictably, if key points were harder to take, then raiding became more expensive and less certain. That did not make Wessex invulnerable. It made Wessex harder to surprise. This distinction matters. Alfred was not creating a modern state. He was working within the limits of 9th century kingship. Local elites, seasonal obligations, religious authority, regional loyalties, and the constant need to persuade people that the burdens placed on them were necessary. A defense system requires trust as well as command. People must believe that labor, taxes, service, and obedience will produce protection. The Vikings had damaged that belief across England. Alfred tried to rebuild it in Wessex. His answer also involved knowledge. Alfred's reputation as a patron of learning, translation, and Christian kingship was not separate from survival. In a world where political order had been shaken, texts, law, religion, and royal messaging helped explain why obedience to Wessex mattered. A kingdom under military stress needs more than defenses. It needs a story about why those defenses are worth building. But that story was attached to material reality. If Alfred had preached order without building defenses, the words would have been thin. If he had built walls without political meaning, the system might have felt like forced labor alone. His strength was in connecting practical defense to a larger vision of Christian kingship, English survival, and royal responsibility. That connection helped Wessex endure. It also shaped the future of England. The Viking presence did not vanish after Eddington. Scandinavian settlement continued. Danish law and custom took root in large parts of eastern and northern England. Towns, names, trade, landholding patterns, and legal identities would carry the marks of that presence for generations. Alfred's victory did not undo the transformation begun by the Great Army. It set limits around it. Those limits would later allow Alfred's successors to expand Wessex power and push toward a more unified English kingdom. In that sense, the Viking threat unintentionally strengthened the political future of Wessex. By forcing Alfred to organize, fortify, define boundaries, and sharpen royal authority, Viking pressure helped create the conditions for a stronger English state. That was the irony. The invaders who nearly destroyed Wessex also forced Wessex to become more coherent. Still, no one living through it would have experienced this as neat historical progress. For them, the cost was immediate. Building a burh meant labor taken from fields. Serving in defense meant time away from family and work. Paying for war meant pressure on local resources. Living near the boundary between Wessex and Viking-controlled areas meant uncertainty about law, lordship, language, and loyalties. A settlement can bring peace and still leave fear behind. Guthrum's baptism did not erase memory. Alfred's fortifications did not restore the dead. Treaties did not make divided communities whole again. They created a framework in which survival could continue, and sometimes that is the most a ruler can accomplish after a world has been broken. This is why Alfred's response matters so deeply in the story of the Viking Age. He did not simply defeat a Viking army, he changed the conditions under which Viking power operated in southern England. He made raiding less easy. He made resistance more organized. He accepted that some losses could not be reversed quickly. He treated survival not as a single battle, but as a system that had to be maintained. Alfred did not defeat Viking power by becoming more heroic. He survived by making fear administrative. That was not romantic. It was effective, and it shows a major shift in the Viking Age. The raiders had forced Europe to adapt. Once kings adapted, Viking leaders faced new choices. They could keep raiding where profit remained possible. They could settle where land was available. They could negotiate where rulers were desperate. Or they could accept baptism, titles, and borders, stepping into the very political language they had once ignored. In England, that process produced the Danelaw and a long struggle between Scandinavian and Anglo-Saxon power. Across the Channel, the same logic would produce something even stranger. A Frankish king, unable to stop the violence at the mouth of the Seine, would offer land to a Viking leader. The deal would be practical, humiliating, dangerous, and historically explosive. The next chapter begins with parchment, river fog, and a bargain that turned a raider into a duke. The bargain did not begin with trust. It began with exhaustion. By the early 10th century, the lands of the West Franks had lived for centuries. The lands of the West Franks had lived for generations under the pressure of Viking movement. Fleets had entered rivers, attacked towns, threatened monasteries, demanded payments, and exposed how difficult it was for kings to protect every vulnerable point at once. The Seine was not simply a river on a map. It was a corridor into the political heart of a kingdom that could not always defend its own arteries. Frankish rulers had tried different answers. They fought when they could. They paid when they had to. They fortified where possible. Local nobles defended their own territories, sometimes more effectively than distant kings. But repeated Viking pressure had changed the political reality. The enemy was not always a single army that could be crushed once and for all. It was a recurring problem, made worse by rivers, divided authority, and the practical limits of early medieval kingship. Then came the solution that looked, at first glance, like surrender. In 9111, Charles the Simple, king of the West Franks, reached an agreement with a Viking leader known as Rollo. The traditional name attached to this arrangement is the Treaty of Saint-Clair-sur-Epte. The basic outline is famous. Rollo received lands around Rouen and the lower Seine, and in return he was expected to defend the region, accept a place inside the Frankish political order, and help prevent other Viking attacks. The details are not as clean as later stories make them sound. Much of what we know about Rollo and the early Normans comes through later sources, especially narratives written after Normandy had already become powerful and wanted a usable origin story. Rollo's exact background is debated. Some traditions make him Danish, others connect him with Norway. The ceremony, the terms, and the personal drama around the treaty were likely shaped by later memory. But the political meaning is clear enough. A Frankish king gave land to a Viking leader because land had become cheaper than endless insecurity. That sentence carries the crisis inside it. Land was supposed to be the foundation of royal authority. To grant it to a former raider was not a small concession. It meant admitting that violence could not always be kept outside the system. Sometimes it had to be absorbed, redirected, named, baptized, bordered, and made responsible for the very peace it had threatened. Rouen mattered because of where it stood. Control around the lower Seine could help secure a route that had been repeatedly dangerous. If Rollo and his followers could be turned into defenders of that route, then a problem might become a barrier against future problems. The logic was not sentimental. Charles was not rewarding Viking violence out of admiration. He was trying to buy stability with the material he still had: territory, recognition, and political legitimacy. For Rollo, the bargain offered something raiding alone could not provide. A successful raid could bring silver. A successful settlement could bring continuity. Land meant food, rents, followers, hostages, marriages, fields, local labor, and a place in which sons could inherit more than a reputation for terror. It changed the question from what can be taken this season to what can be held next year. That change demanded adaptation. A Viking leader who accepted land in Francia could not remain only the chief of a mobile warband. He had to deal with farmers, churches, local elites, boundaries, tribute, defense, and law. He had to become legible to a Christian political world. Baptism, whether immediate in practice or shaped by later narrative, represented that larger transition. It gave the arrangement a language that Frankish society could understand. Conversion did not make the past disappear. It made the future negotiable. Imagine a local man near Rouen in the years after the agreement. He does not experience the treaty as a grand historical turning point. He sees new armed men on roads he already knew. He hears unfamiliar names attached to familiar fields. He watches a clerk or churchman record obligations that still have to be paid, though perhaps now to different protectors. The smoke from hearths smells the same. The mud on the path is the same. But the authority above the village has changed its accent. For ordinary people, that is what political transformation often feels like. Not a clear ending, but a change in who has the right to demand. The early Norman settlement was not a simple replacement of one people by another. It was a process of mixing, bargaining, intermarriage, Christianization, language shift, and elite adaptation. Scandinavian leaders and followers entered a Frankish environment and, over generations, became something new. Their descendants would speak a Romance language, fight as Christian aristocrats, build churches and castles, and participate in the politics of Western Europe. Yet the origin mattered. Normandy was born from a frontier bargain. Its first political function was not poetic destiny. It was defense. A dangerous outsider was turned into a local power because the kingdom needed someone strong enough to hold a violent edge. That gave Normandy a character that was both integrated and aggressive. It belonged to the Frankish world, but it remembered movement, war, and opportunity. This is why Normandy became such an important chapter in the Viking story. It shows the moment when Viking violence stopped being treated only as invasion and began to be used as governance. The Frankish king did not simply defeat Rollo. He did not simply pay him to leave. He gave him a stake in order. That stake changed the incentives. A raider who owned land had reason to defend land. A leader whose authority depended on recognition had reason to protect the political language that recognized him. The bargain was risky. If Rollo remained unreliable, the Seine would still be threatened. If he became too strong, Normandy could become a power in its own right. If Frankish authority weakened, the local ruler who had once been a solution could become nearly independent. Every emergency settlement carries a future cost because survival in the moment often creates a new actor that no one can fully control later. That is what happened. Normandy did not remain a passive border zone. It grew into a dynamic principality with its own aristocracy, military culture, religious institutions, and political ambitions. The descendants of those Viking settlers became Normans, no longer simply Scandinavian raiders, not fully identical to the older Frankish nobility, but a new elite formed from adaptation and violence. The transformation was practical before it was legendary. A Norman lord needed legitimacy. He needed local cooperation. He needed church support. He needed armed followers who could be rewarded. He needed peasants to work land, clergy to sanctify order, scribes to preserve claims, and neighbors to take him seriously. The tools of rule were not the same as the tools of raiding, even if the men who first arrived had carried weapons in both worlds. This is where the Viking Age becomes more complicated than the image of longships against burning skies. The most successful raiders did not remain permanently outside Europe. They entered it, and Europe changed them as much as they changed Europe. In Normandy, the old maritime threat became landed aristocracy. The axe did not disappear, but it was joined by the seal, the charter, the church altar, and the inherited estate. A scribe at a table can be as important as a warrior on a beach. Picture the wax seal pressed into a document. The room is dim. A candle burns low. The parchment records rights, obligations, names, land, boundaries, the slow language of permanence. Outside that document is a history of raids, fear, ships, burned settlements, and uneasy concessions. Inside it is a different kind of force. Authority made durable because someone has written it down and others have been made to accept it. This was not peace in the modern sense. It was managed violence. Normandy's rulers would continue to fight, expand, and pressure their neighbors. They would become famous, not for softness, but for disciplined aggression. Yet that aggression now operated from within the structures of Christian Europe. They were no longer only the men in ships. They were lords with claims, allies, heirs, bishops, and courts. That was the deeper shift. Normandy was not the end of Viking violence. It was what happened when violence learned to sign its name. The agreement of 911 did not instantly create the Normandy that would conquer England in 1066. That later story required generations of consolidation, assimilation, warfare, church building, and political ambition. But the seed was planted in this early bargain. Land for defense, recognition for loyalty, legitimacy for restraint. The restraint was never complete. It rarely is. A ruler created from a warrior elite does not forget the usefulness of force. Normandy would grow stronger, more organized, and more dangerous. By the time William, Duke of Normandy, crossed the Channel in 1066, the old Viking identity had been transformed almost beyond recognition. His army was not a Viking fleet in the old sense. It was a Norman invasion force, Christian, aristocratic, feudal, disciplined, and legally obsessed with claim. And yet, beneath that later conquest, stood the old pattern. Movement became settlement. Settlement became legitimacy. Legitimacy became ambition. The story of Rollo and Normandy reveals one of the central truths of the Viking Age. Europe did not simply defeat the Vikings. It often survived them by absorbing them. But absorption was never neutral. The outsider brought into the system could become one of its sharpest instruments. England had answered Viking pressure with fortification and boundary. Francia answered with land and recognition. Far to the east, another transformation was happening along rivers that led not to monasteries or Frankish courts, but toward markets, tribute routes, steppe politics, and the distant prestige of Constantinople. The next chapter follows the Vikings beyond the western seas, into the world of the Varangians, the Rus, and river power. Not every Viking road led west. Some ran east through forests, rivers, portages, markets, tribute zones, and the long corridors between the Baltic world and the wealth of Byzantium and the Islamic lands. These routes did not create the same image as Lindisfarne or Paris. There were fewer burning monasteries in the popular imagination, fewer coastlines suddenly filled with terror. But the Eastern Road was just as important. Here, Scandinavian power did not move only as a raid against a Christian shore. It moved through river systems, trading posts, tribute networks, armed escorts, local alliances, and the slow making of authority across enormous distances. In the West, ships had turned coasts into targets. In the East, boats and rivers helped turn movement into rule. The people often called Varangians were part of this world. The term could refer to Scandinavian adventurers, traders, warriors, and elites who moved through Eastern Europe and into the Byzantine orbit. They were not entering an empty land. That point matters. The regions that would become associated with Rus were already inhabited by Slavic, Finnic, Baltic, and other peoples with their own communities, trade, tribute arrangements, local powers, and connections to steppe and river networks. The Norse did not arrive in a vacuum. They entered a landscape already alive with politics. The difference was that they brought a particular skill set. Mobility by water, armed organization, long-distance exchange, and the ability to operate between worlds. They could move from the Baltic into river systems that pointed south and east. The Volga route connected northern traders toward the Caspian and the Islamic world. The Dnieper route opened a path toward the Black Sea and Constantinople. These were not easy roads. A river route can sound smooth on a map, but the reality was physical, dangerous, and slow. Boats had to be managed through currents, shallows, rapids, and stretches, where water did not connect cleanly to water. At portages, Vessels and cargo might have to be dragged overland. Men pulled ropes through mud, wood scraped against wet earth, hands burned under strain. Mosquitoes rose from marshland. Somewhere nearby, a guard watched the tree line, because a trading route was also a place where ambush could turn profit into death. That small scene reveals the deeper mechanism. River power required labor. It required men who knew where to cross, where to camp, where to trade, whom to threaten, whom to pay, and whom to avoid. A successful group on these routes needed more than courage. It needed information, discipline, relationships, and enough force to make tribute and protection believable. This is where trade and coercion again became hard to separate. A trader moving along a river needed security. A warrior who provided security could demand payment. A group that collected payment could begin calling it tribute. A leader who controlled tribute along a route could begin to look less like a temporary adventurer and more like a ruler. The names in this story are wrapped in source problems. The Russian Primary Chronicle, compiled later, gives famous accounts of figures such as Rurik and Oleg. It describes the calling of Varangian rulers and the movement of political power toward Kiev. These narratives are essential to the memory of Rus, but they are not neutral records. They were written with religious, dynastic, and political meanings attached. A careful history cannot treat them as simple eyewitness reporting. Still, the broad pattern can be discussed. By the late 9th and early 10th centuries, centers such as Novgorod and Kiev became linked to emerging Rus power. Kiev, especially, held a strategic position on the Dnieper route toward Byzantium. To control Kiev was not merely to possess a town. It was to sit on a passage between northern forests, steppe zones, river trade, tribute-paying communities, and the glittering world of Constantinople. Oleg, traditionally associated with the consolidation of power around Kiev, belongs partly to history and partly to the political memory preserved by later writing. The famous story of his campaigns and dealings with Byzantium must be handled with caution. But the logic behind the story is believable. A ruler who controlled routes toward Constantinople could use both force and diplomacy to gain wealth, prestige, and recognition. Constantinople was not just a city in this imagination. It was a magnet to men moving south from the north. Byzantium represented wealth, status, trade, employment, danger, and legitimacy. Scandinavian warriors would later serve in Byzantine contexts, most famously in the Varangian Guard. That later institution belongs to a broader history, but it shows the same pattern. Northern warriors entering imperial systems, selling military skill, and being reshaped by the political worlds they served. The Eastern Road therefore complicates the simple Viking stereotype. A man could be a raider in one context, a trader in another, a tribute collector in another, and a mercenary in another. He could move between pagan Scandinavia, Slavic settlements, Islamic silver networks, and Christian imperial diplomacy. The river did not ask him to choose one identity forever. It rewarded adaptation. Adaptation, however, was not innocent. Tribute meant pressure. Local communities were not just scenery along the route. They provided goods, labor, food, furs, slaves, and payments. A distant trade network that looks elegant in a historical atlas could feel very different to a village expected to deliver resources to armed men who controlled passage and punishment. Imagine a small riverside community watching boats approach. The sound comes first: oars, voices, wood against water. Then men step onto the bank. Some may be there to trade, some may be there to collect. The difference matters deeply to the people waiting with furs, grain, honey, wax, or whatever obligation has been demanded. Smoke from hearths hangs low near the river. Children are kept back. Older men speak carefully. No one knows whether this visit will remain business or become violent. That uncertainty was part of the system. Control over a route does not require constant battle. It requires enough force that people know battle is possible. It requires repetition, so communities understand the expectation. It requires a political story, so extraction can begin to look like order rather than one robbery after another. That is how river power moves towards state formation. Rus was not simply a Viking kingdom dropped whole onto Eastern Europe. It was a fusion of groups, routes, local societies, tribute structures, and elite cultures. Norse names and practices existed beside Slavic language and local institutions. Over time, Scandinavian elites were absorbed into a wider Rus identity. The process was neither pure conquest nor pure trade. It was a long entanglement. This is why modern arguments over Rus origins can become so heated. They are not only about the 9th century, they are also about later national memory. For this documentary, the safest approach is neither to erase the Norse role nor exaggerate it into a fantasy of complete creation. The Varangians mattered because they helped organize military and commercial power along routes that already existed inside a populated world. Their influence was real, but it worked through fusion. By the late 10th century, that fusion had taken a dramatic religious turn. Vladimir of Kiev's conversion to Christianity in 988 is one of the major turning points in the history of Rus. The traditional accounts of how and why he chose Byzantine Christianity are full of memorable narrative, but they were shaped by later religious writing. Politically, the conversion made sense on a large scale. It connected Kiev to the prestige of Constantinople. It gave the ruler a sacred language of authority. It helped bind elite power to church structures, ceremony, literacy, and international recognition. This was not the same path as Normandy, but the pattern is familiar. Violence alone was not enough. Trade alone was not enough. A ruler who wanted durability needed legitimacy that others could recognize. In Normandy, that meant Christian aristocratic integration into the Frankish world. In Rus, conversion tied ruling authority to the Byzantine religious and diplomatic sphere. The old movement by water had entered the world of altars, treaties, churches, and dynastic memory. A boat hauled across a muddy portage and a prince baptized under Byzantine influence may seem to belong to different histories. They do not. One reveals the material difficulty of controlling routes. The other reveals the political reward once route control becomes rulership. The Eastern story also shows why the Viking Age is larger than Western fear. In England and Francia, many sources describe Vikings through the trauma of attack. Along the eastern routes, the picture is more layered. Raiding, trading, tribute, state formation, diplomacy, service, settlement, and conversion. The same broader Scandinavian world could produce terror in one region and political foundations in another. It could burn a monastery on one edge of Europe and help connect northern forests to Constantinople on another. That does not make the story gentler. It makes it wider. The Rus world developed beyond its Scandinavian elements, and over generations those elements became absorbed into new identities. This absorption is one of the recurring patterns of Viking power. The more deeply Scandinavian elites entered local systems, the more successful they could become, and the less purely Scandinavian their political future remained. That was not failure. It was transformation. The same had happened in different form in Normandy. The same would happen in parts of England. The same process was beginning inside Scandinavia itself, where kings learned that raiding abroad and ruling at home required different tools. Christianization, royal monuments, law, tribute, and dynastic claims began to reshape the north from within. On the eastern rivers, the lesson was especially clear. Movement opened the route. Force protected it. Trade enriched it. Tribute disciplined it. Religion legitimized it. Memory later turned it into origin. On the eastern rivers, the Vikings did not simply raid kingdoms. They learned how roots become states. That is the reason the Varangian and Rus story belongs inside the larger Viking Age. It proves that the Viking transformation was not confined to the North Sea or the coasts of Francia. It stretched across the waterways of Europe, into markets where Islamic silver moved toward Constantinople's walls, and into the political foundations of Eastern Christian rulership. But the story now has to return north, because while Viking power was being absorbed in Normandy and fused into Rus, Scandinavia itself was changing. Chiefs were becoming kings. Old gods were being challenged by Christian symbols. Stones were being raised to announce authority in a new language. The next chapter begins not with a raid, but with a rune stone standing in the wind. The Viking Age did not only transform the places the Vikings attacked, it transformed Scandinavia itself. For generations, wealth had moved back across the sea. Silver, captives, ornaments, weapons, stories, contacts, and ideas. A successful voyage did not end when a ship touched home soil. It entered halls, families, rivalries, marriages, feasts, oaths, and political ambitions. Foreign wealth became local authority. A man who could reward followers could gather more of them. A leader whose name traveled could make others listen more carefully. But raiding abroad could not solve every problem at home. Inside Scandinavia, power was still fragmented. Local chieftains, regional rulers, kin groups, warrior followings, trading centers, and religious traditions all mattered. Authority did not descend neatly from a single throne. It had to be negotiated, displayed, fought for, inherited, challenged, and remembered. The North was not waiting passively to become a kingdom. It had to be made into one. That process was uneven, violent, and difficult. Denmark, Norway, and Sweden did not develop in identical ways, and the chronology must be handled carefully. Later saga traditions often turn state formation into a series of dramatic personalities and heroic confrontations. There is truth inside some of that memory, but also simplification. Kingship was not created by one speech, one battle, or one conversion. It grew through pressure, tribute, warfare, trade, law, ritual, and the slow narrowing of local independence. Still, certain images survive because they reveal the direction of change. One of the strongest stands at Jelling in Denmark. The Jelling stones, especially the larger stone associated with Harald Bluetooth in the late 10th century, are not just monuments. They are political statements cut into stone. Harald claimed to have won all Denmark and Norway and made the Danes Christian. The exact scope and meaning of those claims can be debated, but the ambition is unmistakable. A ruler was presenting himself not merely as a successful war leader, but as a king whose authority could be named, carved, sanctified, and placed in the landscape for others to see. A rune stone does not raid. It declares, imagine the stone carver at work. The air is cold. The tool bites slowly into the surface. Dust gathers near the cuts. The text is not a private note. It is meant to outlast voices in a hall, to stand in weather, to make power visible even when the king is elsewhere. Nearby, the old world has not vanished. People still remember older gods, older loyalties, older local powers. But now a Christian symbol and a royal claim are being placed into the same public object. This is how transformation often looks. Not a clean replacement, but an overlap. Christianization did not spread through Scandinavia as a simple story of light replacing darkness, and it should not be written that way. Religion was belief, but it was also diplomacy, status, marriage, literacy, kingship, and access to the recognized political language of Europe. A ruler who became Christian could speak more easily with Christian kings. He could support bishops, build churches, claim sacred legitimacy, and present obedience to his rule as part of a wider moral order. That did not mean conversion was always gentle. For some communities, it meant pressure from above. For some chieftains, it meant choosing between resistance and survival inside a changing order. For some rulers, it meant using a new faith to discipline rivals. The older religious landscape did not disappear overnight, and Christian kingship had to work through local realities. The process was gradual, regional, contested, and deeply political. Harald Bluetooth's Denmark shows why this mattered. A king trying to consolidate authority needed more than warriors. He needed symbols that could bind people beyond the immediate reach of his household. He needed roots, fortresses, churches, tribute, coinage, marriages, and recognition. He needed to make Denmark feel like something more coherent than a collection of local powers. The Jelling claim was part of that work. It turned kingship into memory before memory could drift away. In Norway, the process was even more difficult in some ways. Geography itself resisted easy rule. Fjords, mountains, local communities, and regional elites made centralization hard. Later saga traditions attach the making of Norwegian kingship to figures such as Harald Fairhair, Hakon the Good, Olaf Tryggvason, and Olaf Haraldsson. Each belongs to a mixture of history and memory, with different degrees of reliability depending on the source and period. But beneath the stories is a recognizable pattern. Kings tried to gather power over regions that had strong local identities. They used warfare, alliances, marriage, tribute, religious change, and claims of descent. Some looked outward, raiding or ruling abroad, because foreign wealth could support domestic ambition. Others used Christianity as a tool of consolidation, aligning themselves with the wider European order while challenging local traditions. State formation in Scandinavia was not the end of Viking energy. It redirected it. A chieftain with a fleet could raid. A king with a fleet could claim taxes, call assemblies, defend trade routes, enforce Christianity, pressure rivals, and launch campaigns with a different level of legitimacy. The same maritime world that once supported mobile warbands could now support royal power. But royal power carried a burden. Once a ruler claimed to be king of a people, he had to do more than win. He had to keep order. He had to manage followers who expected reward. He had to balance old elites with new churchmen. He had to defend coasts and trading places. He had to make violence appear lawful when it served him and criminal when it served someone else. That was not easy. Many Scandinavian rulers faced rebellion, assassination, exile, contested succession, or fragile authority. Kingship made ambition larger, but it also made failure more visible. A raider could disappear after defeat. A king had subjects who remembered. A hall can forget a boast. A kingdom remembers a tax. Consider a local farmer or craftsman under this changing order. The king is not an abstract title to him. The king appears through demands: labor, tribute, military service, religious pressure, market regulation, loyalty to a distant ruler whose face he may never see. A church is built nearby. A local chieftain shifts allegiance. A royal representative arrives. The old obligations do not simply vanish. They are reorganized. The smell of smoke from the hearth is the same. The fields still need work, boats still need repair, children still need feeding, but the language of authority has begun to change around everyday life. This is the human cost of state formation. It is rarely as dramatic as a raid, but it reaches deeper. Raiding strikes the outside world and brings wealth home. Kingship reaches into the home and asks who owes what to whom. It turns success abroad into pressure at home. It demands that communities become legible to rulers who want service, tax, and obedience. That is why Christian kingship mattered so much. A church could help preserve written memory. Clergy could support royal ideology. Baptism could link a ruler to a recognized international order. Saints could become political anchors. Law could be framed in Christian terms. The old war leader, if successful enough, could begin to look like a guardian of moral order rather than merely a man with armed followers. Yet this new language did not erase the older logic of force. It organized it. Harald Bluetooth's world, the later struggles of Norwegian kings, and the gradual Christianization of the North all show the same broad movement. Viking power was entering the age of kingdoms. The energy that had once flowed outward through raids now helped build more centralized authority at home. The sea still mattered. Ships still mattered. War still mattered. But now these tools were increasingly tied to dynastic claims, territorial rule, church support, and the political expectation that a king should command more than a seasonal following. This shift also changed Europe's relationship with Scandinavia. A Viking warband was one kind of threat. A Christian Scandinavian king was another. He could still invade, raid, or demand tribute, but he could also marry into royal families, negotiate with other Christian rulers, issue laws, support bishops, and claim thrones through recognizable political arguments. The North was not becoming harmless. It was becoming harder to dismiss as merely outside civilization. That mattered profoundly in England. By the early 11th century, Scandinavian kings were not only raiding English shores, they were competing for the English crown. Sweyn Forkbeard, King of Denmark, would force his way into English politics. His son Cnut would go further, turning conquest into kingship and building a North Sea realm that joined England, Denmark, and later Norway under one ruler. That achievement did not come from nowhere. It depended on generations of transformation. Ships had created reach. Silver had created followings. Winter camps had created presence. Settlements had created local stakes. Christianization had created legitimacy. Scandinavian kingship had created rulers capable of thinking beyond a single raid. The gelling stone and the English throne belonged to the same long process. One carved a claim into rock. The other would test whether that claim could rule across the sea. The Vikings became most dangerous when their kings learned that a crown could do what an axe could not. make obedience look permanent. That permanence was never guaranteed. It had to be defended, funded, sanctified, and inherited. Every Scandinavian ruler who reached for larger authority faced the same difficulty. The tools that built power also attracted rivals. Wealth created followers, but followers expected payment. Christian legitimacy helped kings, but it also bound them to new standards and institutions. Conquest opened doors, but ruling demanded patience. Still, by the time Cnut appears, the transformation is impossible to miss. The Viking Age began, in European memory, with ships striking holy places from the sea. But by the 11th century, Scandinavian rulers had learned to operate inside the language of European monarchy. They could arrive not only as raiders, but as claimants, not only as destroyers, but as rulers who expected bishops, nobles, moneyers, soldiers, and subjects to recognize their authority. The next chapter follows that transformation to its most dramatic Western form. A Scandinavian conqueror will take England and discover that winning the kingdom is easier than making it routine. The throne did not end the conquest. It exposed the next problem. In 1016, Cnut became King of England after years of crisis, invasion, betrayal, exhaustion, and royal failure. He was not the first Scandinavian ruler to force himself into English politics. His father, Svein Forkbeard, had already shown that Danish kingship could reach across the North Sea and threaten the English crown directly. But Svein's rule in England was brief. He died in 1014, leaving behind a question sharper than victory. Could a Scandinavian conqueror actually keep England? Cnut answered that question better than almost anyone before him. He did not arrive in a world waiting peacefully for him. England had suffered through the long and troubled reign of Athelred, later remembered by the nickname the Unready, a term that means more like poorly advised than simply unprepared. Viking attacks, tribute payments, political distrust, elite instability, and repeated military pressure had weakened royal authority. The kingdom was rich, but wealth had made it a target. It had institutions, but institutions could be bent by fear. It had a church, coinage, law, and aristocracy, but none of those things automatically guaranteed loyalty to a king who could not protect them. Then Cnut came not as a raider passing through, but as a claimant with an army. His struggle with Edmund Ironside, son of Athelred, pushed England into a final violent contest. Edmund resisted fiercely, and for a time England was divided between them. But Edmund died in 1016, and Cnut became ruler of the whole kingdom. The battlefield had opened the door. Death and settlement cleared the room. Yet Cnut's real achievement began after that. A lesser conqueror might have treated England as a prize to be stripped. Cnut treated it as a kingdom to be operated. That difference is essential. England was too valuable to ruin, too complex to rule by foreign warriors alone, and too politically developed to be managed only through fear. To keep it, Cnut had to enter its systems without becoming trapped by them. He needed English nobles. He needed bishops. He needed coinage. He needed law. He needed tax. This was where Viking power reached one of its strangest forms. Not the sudden violence of Lindisfarne, not the river pressure of Francia, not the winter camp, not the frontier bargain of Normandy, but a Scandinavian king seated inside one of the wealthiest and most administratively useful kingdoms in Europe. Imagine the first months of his reign not as a saga scene, but as a room of practical tension, a royal hall. armed men close enough to remind everyone how the crown was won. English elites watching carefully, deciding how much of the new order could be survived, used, or resisted. Clerks and churchmen waiting to see whether this conqueror would destroy the machinery of the kingdom or learn to command it. Cnut chose command. He executed or removed dangerous rivals when he believed he had to. He rewarded followers. He distributed authority. He married Emma of Normandy, the widow of Athelred, creating a link to the previous royal house and to Norman connections across the Channel. It was a political marriage with enormous symbolic value. Through Emma, Cnut did not simply take England by force. He attached himself to its royal memory. That mattered because conquest leaves scars. A new king needs more than obedience. He needs people to behave tomorrow as if today's violence has become normal. Marriage, church patronage, law, and continuity helped make that possible. Cnut could present himself not merely as an invader, but as a lawful Christian king restoring order after years of chaos. This was not hypocrisy in the simple sense. It was statecraft. Cnut understood that England's existing institutions were more useful alive than broken. The English kingdom already had sophisticated coinage, royal administration, legal traditions, shire structures, and mechanisms for raising revenue. Destroying those systems would weaken the very prize he had fought to obtain. So he worked through them. He issued laws in the tradition of English kingship. He cultivated the church. He used English advisors alongside Scandinavian followers. He made himself legible to the kingdom he had conquered. A conqueror who wants to last must eventually stop looking like an interruption. He must begin to look like procedure. This is where the human cost becomes quieter, but not smaller. Picture a moneyer or tax official in London after the conquest. The room smells of metal, smoke, wax, and worn cloth. Silver is counted, weighed, stamped, recorded. Names change above the documents, but the demand remains below them. A new king needs soldiers paid, allies rewarded, ships maintained, enemies deterred, and authority displayed. The coin may carry royal legitimacy. The hand that pays it belongs to someone who still has to live with the cost. For ordinary people, the difference between an English king and a Danish king could become less important than the question of what the king demanded. War had been expensive. Tribute had been expensive. Conquest was expensive too. Cnut's rule depended in part on the wealth of England. The kingdom's tax capacity, especially the systems shaped by previous decades of tribute and military payment, gave him resources that earlier Viking leaders could only dream of. What had once been extracted under the pressure of attack could now be collected under the authority of kingship. That is the coldest transformation in this chapter. The money that had once paid Vikings to leave could now help a Viking king rule. Cnut did not rule England alone. After becoming king of Denmark in 1018 and later asserting power over Norway in 1028, he created what historians often call a North Sea Empire or North Sea realm. The phrase can make the arrangement sound more stable than it was. It was not a centralized empire in the Roman sense. It was a personal and dynastic construction stretching across seas, aristocracies, churches, military obligations, and regional ambitions. Still, it was extraordinary. A Scandinavian ruler governed England, Denmark, and Norway through a mixture of force, inheritance, opportunity, elite cooperation, and Christian kingship. The North Sea, once a route for raiders, became the interior water of a political system. The same sea that had carried ships to monasteries now connected royal claims, tax revenues, military movements, and diplomatic relationships. But distance did not disappear because Cnut wore a crown. England had its own elites. Denmark had its own power structures. Norway had its own regional resistance and ambitions. Ruling across the North Sea required constant balancing. Cnut had to maintain legitimacy in multiple worlds at once: English, Danish, Norwegian, Christian, warrior aristocratic, and dynastic. Each world had expectations. Each could become dangerous if ignored. This is why Cnut's reign is so revealing. He shows the Viking transformation at its highest western point. The outsider becomes king. The war leader becomes lawgiver. The raiding tradition is absorbed into Christian monarchy. The sea road becomes a political connection. But the very success of this transformation exposes a weakness. It depends heavily on the ruler's ability to hold the arrangement together. A ship can be steered by one hand. A kingdom cannot. Cnut was skilled enough to understand that. He supported churches and monasteries, including those that belonged to the same Christian world. Earlier, Vikings had once terrorized. He presented himself as a pious ruler. He made a pilgrimage to Rome in 1027, attending the imperial coronation of Conrad II and engaging in the diplomatic theater of Christian Europe. This was not a raider at the edge of the map. This was a king placing himself inside the center of recognized authority. The symbolism is hard to miss. A Scandinavian dynasty that had grown through the violence of the Viking Age now sought confirmation in the language of Christian kingship. The journey to Rome was not merely spiritual display. It strengthened Cnut's image as a legitimate ruler among other rulers, a monarch whose authority belonged inside the European order rather than outside it. That did not make him gentle. Cnut could be ruthless. His consolidation of power involved killing or removing threats, managing elites, and using force when necessary. Christian legitimacy did not erase political violence. It gave violence a framework in which it could be justified, remembered, and administered. The English Church, for its part, had reasons to cooperate. A stable king could protect property, confirm privileges, support religious institutions, and restore order after decades of disruption. Churchmen did not have to forget the horror of earlier raids to recognize the advantage of working with a ruler who now controlled the kingdom. Institutions often survive by making peace with power after power changes hands. That is not cynicism. It is history under pressure. Cnut's England was therefore not a simple occupation. It was a negotiated kingdom. Scandinavian warriors remained important, but Cnut could not govern only through them. English nobles and churchmen mattered. Law mattered. Coinage mattered. Regional administration mattered. The old kingdom had not been erased. It had been captured, reconfigured, and made to serve a new ruler. For the Viking Age, this was a decisive crossing. The raider had become not only a ruler, but a manager of the very systems that earlier raids had exploited. Monasteries were no longer only targets. They were institutions to patronize. English wealth was no longer only loot, it was revenue. The church was no longer only a victim in the story, it was a partner in legitimacy. The people were no longer only communities to frighten. They were subjects whose productivity had to continue. That required restraint as much as force. A ruler who burns too much has less to tax. A ruler who humiliates every local elite creates rebellions he may not have time to crush. A ruler who ignores the church loses a language of legitimacy that his enemies can use against him. Cnut's strength lay in understanding that conquest had to be translated into continuity. Cnut proved that the final form of Viking conquest was not the raid, but the receipt. That receipt could be a coin, a tax record, a royal writ, a payment to soldiers, a confirmation to a church, or an obligation placed on a local community. It represented something older Viking raiding had only approached from outside, the ability to make extraction routine. Routine is what separates plunder from rule. Still, the North Sea realm contained its own fragility. It was impressive because Cnut was impressive. That is also why it was vulnerable. Personal authority can join regions together, but it does not always create institutions strong enough to survive the person who built the arrangement. England, Denmark, and Norway did not become one deeply integrated state. They were held in relationship by dynasty, force, prestige, elite negotiation, and the practical reach of one king. When such a ruler dies, every seam becomes visible. Cnut died in 1035. The realm he had held together did not immediately vanish in a single dramatic collapse, but it weakened quickly. Succession disputes, regional priorities, rival claimants, and old political identities reasserted themselves. England would pass through uncertainty, short reigns, and shifting loyalties before the return of Edward the Confessor and the long road to the crisis of 1066. The lesson is not that Cnut failed. In many ways, he succeeded brilliantly. He achieved what earlier raiders could not. He ruled England as king, commanded respect across Europe, and turned Scandinavian power into lawful monarchy. But his success also reveals the limit of the Viking transformation. A raiding system could become a kingdom. A kingdom could become a multi-realm monarchy. But unless that structure became deeper than the ruler's own authority, it could begin to loosen as soon as his hand was gone. The sea that connected his realm could also divide it. After Cnut, the North Sea world did not simply return to what it had been. Too much had changed. Scandinavian kings had proven they could claim England. English politics had been tied to Denmark and Norway. Normandy waited across the Channel, connected through Emma, dynastic memory and ambition. The old categories were now unstable: English, Danish, Norman, Christian, conqueror, heir. Those categories would collide again. The next chapter begins after the great king's death, when the map he held together starts to separate, and England moves, step by step, toward the most famous year in its history. A map can look obedient while the man who holds it is alive. After Cnut died in 1035, the North Sea did not suddenly forget his name. England, Denmark, and Norway still carried the marks of his rule. The roots remained, the elites remained. The memories of conquest, law, taxation, church patronage, and royal command remained. But something essential had changed. The hand that balanced them was gone. Cnut's realm had always depended on more than territory. It depended on movement across water, negotiated loyalty, military reputation, dynastic claim, church support, and the ability to convince different political communities that one ruler could serve their interests better than chaos. England had been rich and administratively useful. Denmark had been dynastic ground. Norway had been harder to hold, more distant in its loyalties, and more vulnerable to local resistance. Under Cnut, these regions could be imagined as parts of a North Sea order. After him, they began to remember they were different. This is the weakness of personal conquest. It can join lands quickly, especially when the conqueror is talented, feared, and politically intelligent. But succession asks a different question. It does not ask whether one man was strong enough to win. It asks whether the structure he built can survive being handled by someone else. In Cnut's case, the answer was uncertain almost immediately. His sons inherited names, claims, and expectations, but not his authority in full. Harold Harefoot and Harthacnut became central figures in the unstable politics after 1035. Their claims were tied not only to blood, but to competing factions, maternal connections, regional support, and the political weight of England and Denmark. Emma of Normandy, Cnut's widow, and before that the wife of Ethelred, remained one of the most important figures linking the Old English royal house, the Danish conquest, and Norman connections across the Channel. That web was powerful. It was also dangerous. A dynastic marriage that once helped Cnut legitimize his rule now connected future claimants to overlapping memories. Emma's sons by Athelred had claims of their own. Her sons by Cnut had another. England was not simply asking who had the strongest army. It was asking which version of legitimacy would be accepted by nobles, churchmen, household troops, regional powers, and foreign relatives watching from across the sea. Succession rarely feels abstract to the people living under it. Imagine a royal clerk in England not long after Cnut's death. The room is dim, lit by a low flame. Wax softens near a seal. Names must be written carefully, because a wrong allegiance can become dangerous when politics turns. A document that yesterday spoke with the confidence of one king now has to fit a new reality. The ink dries slowly. Outside, men who were loyal to Cnut are deciding whether loyalty passes to a son, a faction, a queen, or the safer side of uncertainty. The clerk is not making history in the grand sense, but his hand reveals the problem. Authority has to be written again. Harold Harefoot took power in England, while Harthacnut was occupied in Denmark, facing his own pressures there. This alone shows how difficult the North Sea arrangement had become. A ruler who needed to be in multiple places at once could not always rely on distance to remain patient. England required presence. Denmark required presence. Norway was already slipping from the broader structure Cnut had created. The sea had connected the realm under a strong king. After him, it became a space across which absence could grow. The politics of the late 1030s were marked by faction, suspicion, and shifting recognition. Harold Harefoot became king in England and ruled until 1040. Harthacnut then took the English throne after Harold's death, bringing England and Denmark briefly back under one ruler. But this restoration did not recreate Cnut's full world. It was narrower, more fragile, and shadowed by the fact that the larger North Sea vision had already lost momentum. Harthacnut's reign in England was short. He died in 1042. With him, the direct Danish royal hold over England ended. Edward the Confessor, son of Athelred and Emma, returned to the English throne. This was not a simple return to an untouched Anglo-Saxon past. That past had been altered by decades of Scandinavian conquest, taxation, settlement, elite adaptation, and Norman connection. Edward himself had spent many years in exile in Normandy. His court would carry relationships, habits, and expectations shaped by that experience. So when England turned away from Danish rule, it did not become isolated. It became open to another channel of influence. Normandy waited across the water. This is one of the quiet transitions that makes 1066 possible. The Viking Age did not end by closing doors. It ended by leaving too many doors open. England had been pulled toward Denmark. It had been linked to Normandy through Emma and exile. It had been shaped internally by the Danelaw. Its aristocracy had learned to survive conquest, bargain with foreign rulers, and maneuver around succession crises. Its wealth remained attractive. Its crown remained worth risking everything for. The North Sea dream had broken, but the habits it created remained. England was now a kingdom with a memory of being conquered by Scandinavians, and a political elite familiar with foreign claims. That memory mattered because future claimants would not appear from nowhere. They would arrive carrying arguments. Blood, promise, marriage, oath, exile, victory, divine favor, and the willingness to turn claim into force. The death of Cnut therefore did not remove Viking power from English history. It redistributed the consequences. In Denmark, royal politics continued on its own course. In Norway, local and royal struggles moved beyond the fragile hold Cnut had tried to impose. In England, the throne passed through a period that seemed to restore native rule, but also deepened the conditions for later crisis. The same sea that once linked Cnut's realms now connected claimants, memories, and ambitions waiting for the next opening. For ordinary people, these shifts may have been felt less as grand constitutional change than as continuity under different names. Taxes still had to be paid. Lords still demanded service. Churches still received patronage and protection. Markets still depended on stability. Soldiers still needed feeding. A peasant in the shires might not care whether the king's claim came through Danish conquest or West Saxon blood if the result was another demand at the door. But at the level of high politics, names mattered intensely. A name could gather allies. A lineage could justify invasion. A disputed promise could become a fleet. This was the inheritance Cnut left behind. Not only a memory of Scandinavian success, but a kingdom whose political imagination had been stretched across the sea. England could be ruled from outside. That had been proven. England could be claimed by men with foreign bases and credible arguments. That too had been proven. England's elites might resist, negotiate, accept, betray, or adapt, depending on who seemed most likely to win. In that sense, Cnut's success outlived his dynasty. It changed what was thinkable. Yet the North Sea realm itself could not hold. The arrangement had depended on Cnut's personal capacity to command loyalty across different regions. His heirs did not inherit the same balance of fear, respect, opportunity, and practical acceptance. The structure had no deep administrative unity capable of turning England, Denmark, and Norway into one durable political body. It was a network held by kingship, not a state strong enough to ignore the weakness of succession. Cnut's realm did not break because it had been too small to matter. It broke because it had been too personal to survive him. That was the limit of Viking kingship at its highest point in the West. It could conquer, it could govern, it could use tax, church, law, marriage, and royal ceremony. It could even make the North Sea feel for a moment like a center rather than a boundary. But it still had to answer the oldest dynastic problem. What happens when the ruler who made the system possible is no longer there to enforce the bargain? The answer came slowly, then all at once. Edward the Confessor's reign brought a different atmosphere to England, but not a simple peace. His lack of a direct heir made the succession dangerous. Powerful English nobles, especially the Godwin family, became central to the kingdom's politics. Normandy watched. Scandinavia watched. Claims formed in the background before armies moved in the open. By the 1060s, England stood at the meeting point of several histories. The Anglo-Saxon struggle to survive the Viking Age, the Danish memory of conquest, the Norwegian ambition of Harald Hardrada, the Norman transformation that began with Rollo, the political consequences of Emma's marriages, the wealth of England, the weakness of an unclear succession. No single cause created 1066. The year was a convergence. When Edward died in January 1066, the old question returned in its most dangerous form. Who had the right to rule England, and who had the force to make that right real? Harold Godwinson took the crown. Harald Hardrada of Norway saw opportunity. William of Normandy prepared his own claim. Each man entered the crisis carrying a different piece of the Viking Age's long transformation. One came from the English aristocracy shaped by decades of survival. One came as the last great Scandinavian warrior king reaching for England. One came from Normandy, where Viking settlement had become Christian aristocratic ambition. The North Sea dream had broken after Cnut, but its fragments were still sharp. The next chapter begins in 1066, when England is struck by two invasions in the same autumn, and the Viking Age seems to end by defeating one heir of the Old North, while crowning another in a new form. England entered 1066 with a crown and no easy future. Edward the Confessor died in January, leaving behind a kingdom rich enough to tempt invasion and politically exposed enough to make every claim dangerous. He had ruled after the age of Cnut, after Danish kingship had faded from direct control, after exile in Normandy had tied the English court to continental ambitions. His death did not create England's vulnerability by itself. It revealed how many histories had been waiting beneath the surface. Harold Godwinson took the throne. He was not a weak man. He came from the most powerful noble family in England, with military experience, political reach, and enough support among the English elite to be crowned quickly. But a quick coronation could not silence everyone. Across the sea, William, Duke of Normandy, believed he had a claim. In the north, Harald Hardrada, King of Norway, saw his own path toward England, strengthened by alliance with Tostig, Harold Godwinson's exiled brother. This was not one invasion story. It was a convergence. From Norway came a ruler who looked like the last great warrior of the older northern world. Harald Hardrada had fought across the Byzantine world, Scandinavia, and beyond. His reputation belonged to a violent, ambitious, wide-ranging career. He was not a raider in the simple, early Viking sense. He was a Christian king, a battle-hardened claimant, and a man who understood that England remained one of the greatest prizes in northern Europe. From Normandy came something different. William was not Viking in the old way. He did not speak Old Norse as a raider from the 9th century might have done. His world was French-speaking, Christian, aristocratic, legalistic, and deeply tied to the political culture of Western Europe. Yet Normandy itself had been born from a Viking settlement, from the bargain with Rollo, from the decision to absorb violence by granting it land. In William, that older transformation had matured into a disciplined ducal state capable of planning conquest with paperwork, ships, cavalry, church approval, and a claim sharpened into justification. England faced both histories in the same year. In September, Harald Hardrada landed in the north with a Norwegian force, joined by Tostig. The invasion struck into a region with its own political tensions and memories of Scandinavian rule. At Fulford, near York, Harold and Tostig defeated the northern English earls Edwin and Morcar on September 20, 1066. York submitted. For a moment, the old northern threat seemed alive again. Then Harold Godwinson moved with astonishing speed. He marched north from the south of England, forcing his army across a punishing distance. The journey itself matters. History often remembers the battle more clearly than the bodies required to reach it. Men in mail, men on foot, horses under strain, mud on boots, shields carried along roads that offered no mercy to fatigue. A kingdom was being defended not as an idea, but as a physical act of endurance. On September 25, 1066, at Stamford Bridge, Harold met Harold Hardrada and Tostig. The battle ended in English victory. Harold Hardrada was killed. Tostig was killed. The Norwegian army was shattered so badly that later tradition remembered only a fraction of the invading ships returning home. Exact numbers in medieval sources are often uncertain, and the dramatic scale should be handled carefully. But the outcome is not uncertain. The Norwegian bid for England failed, and with it, the last major Scandinavian attempt to seize the English crown by force came to an end. Stamford Bridge has often been treated as the symbolic end of the Viking Age. There is reason for that. A Norwegian king came in the old pattern of northern ambition, and he died on English soil. The long arc from Lindisfarne, the Great Army, Cnut, and North Sea kingship seemed to close there, beside a river crossing in Yorkshire. The age of Scandinavian warrior kings claiming England had reached its final dramatic defeat. But history did not stop long enough for England to breathe. While Harold was in the north, William crossed the Channel and landed in the south at Pevensey in late September. The timing was brutal. Harold had defeated one invasion only to face another. His army had marched north, fought a major battle, then had to turn south again toward a second enemy who had arrived with a different kind of force. This is where 1066 becomes almost unbearable as a political drama. England had survived the last Viking claimant, but survival had consumed time, strength, and distance. William did not need Harold Hardrada to win on his behalf. But Harold's invasion helped create the conditions in which Harold Godwinson had to defend two ends of his kingdom in the same season. On October 14, 1066, Harold met William at Hastings. The battle was long, hard, and decisive. Harold Godwinson was killed. The Anglo-Saxon royal order was broken. William became King of England, and the Norman conquest began one of the most important transformations in English history. Land redistribution, castle building, aristocratic replacement, church reform, tighter royal control, and a new ruling elite whose roots led back, indirectly but unmistakably, to the Viking settlement of Normandy. A battlefield can end one world before anyone has language for the next. Imagine an English foot soldier in that autumn. He may have marched north through cold roads toward Stamford Bridge, seen the wreckage of one invasion, then been called south before his body had recovered. His shield is marked. His boots are ruined by mud. The food is poor. The news is worse. Somewhere ahead, another army waits, not Norwegian this time, but Norman. Cavalry, archers, infantry, banners, priests, claims, and a duke who insists that conquest is justice. For men like him, 1066 was not an argument over legitimacy. It was exhaustion made political. William's victory was not a Viking victory in the old sense. That distinction matters. The Norman army was not a 9th century raiding band. It did not come only for portable wealth. It came to take the kingdom, to replace an elite, to hold land, to build castles, to record possession, and to make conquest permanent through administration. Yet, the deeper irony remains. The man who defeated the English monarchy was the ruler of a duchy founded by Viking settlement. Normandy had spent generations absorbing Frankish language, Christianity, aristocratic custom, and continental statecraft. By 1066, that process had produced one of the most formidable political military cultures in Europe. The Viking Age did not end simply because Vikings disappeared. It ended because the most successful descendants of the Viking world no longer needed to arrive as Vikings. They had better tools now. William came with a claim, not just a fleet. He sought papal support, not just plunder. He had knights, not only ship crews. He used castles, surveys, land grants, and feudal obligations after victory. The conquest of England was brutal, but it was also administrative. It did not stop at the battlefield. It entered estates, churches, villages, forests, tax records, and law. That makes Hastings a very different ending from Stamford Bridge. At Stamford Bridge, the old northern bid failed. At Hastings, the transformed northern legacy won. Harold Hardrada represented a world still close to the warrior-king tradition of the Viking Age. William represented what happened after that. Tradition passed through land, baptism, language shift, ducal discipline, legal claim, and European legitimacy. The contrast is not perfect. Harold was also Christian and royal. William was also violent and opportunistic. History rarely divides itself into clean symbols, but the narrative force of 1066 lies in the collision of two stages of transformation. One claimant came from the old Scandinavian horizon. The other came from a Viking-founded polity that had learned to speak the language of European power more fluently than many of its neighbors. Harold Godwinson stood between them. His tragedy was not that he lacked courage. His tragedy was that England had become the prize at the intersection of too many ambitions. The wealth that made the kingdom worth ruling also made it worth invading. The political connections that gave English kings international prestige also gave foreign claimants arguments. The long Viking Age had taught surrounding powers that England could be reached, pressured, conquered, and ruled from across the sea. 1066 was therefore not an isolated accident. It was the result of centuries of movement, from Lindisfarne to York, from Danelaw to Cnut, from Rollo to Normandy, from Scandinavian kingship to Norman claim-making. The old sea roads kept returning to England in new forms. The ships changed, the languages changed, the legal arguments changed, but the island remained one of the great prizes of Northern Europe. The Viking Age ended when the raider's descendant no longer came to steal a kingdom, but to inherit one by force. That is the harsh irony of 1066. Harold Hardrada died as the last great Scandinavian claimant to the English crown. Harold Godwinson died defending a kingdom that had spent centuries learning how dangerous the sea could be. William won as the heir of a transformation that began when Viking violence settled, converted, adapted, and became Norman authority. After Hastings, England would not simply have a new king. It would have a new ruling class. Lands would be redistributed. Castles would rise. French-speaking aristocrats would dominate the top of society. The Domesday Survey, completed in 1086, would later show the administrative reach of the new regime with cold precision. Land, holders, values, obligations, resources. That was not the world of Lindisfarne, but it was connected to it. The first Viking raids had revealed that the sea could break sacred confidence. The Great Army had shown that mobile violence could become territorial power. Normandy had shown that a raider could become a duke. Cnut had shown that a Scandinavian conqueror could rule England through tax, law, and church. William showed the final transformation, a Viking-founded dynasty, fully absorbed into European aristocratic culture, could conquer not as an outsider to the system, but as one of its most disciplined predators. The Viking Age, in that sense, did not close like a door. It changed clothes. The next and final chapter is not about one last battle. It is about what survived after the longships faded from the horizon. In towns, laws, languages, dynasties, myths, and the uneasy memory of a people Europe first feared as destroyers, then had to accept as rulers. A longship in a museum is a quiet thing. It does not smell of tar, smoke, sweat, salt, or fear anymore. Its wood is measured, preserved, labeled, lit carefully behind glass. People walk past it slowly. They admire the curve of the hull, the elegance of the construction, the intelligence of the hands that built it. Children look at it and imagine adventure. But the first people who saw ships like that on the horizon were not thinking of adventure. They were thinking of survival. The Viking Age began, in much of Western Europe's memory, with shock. Lindisfarne in 793 gave that shock an image. A holy island, a cold sea, and a community that discovered too late that sacred distance was not defense. But the story did not remain there. If it had, the Vikings would be remembered only as coastal predators, terrifying but temporary. They became more than that. They became rulers because violence opened doors, but adaptation kept them open. The first raids exposed Europe's vulnerabilities. Ships made coasts and rivers unstable. Silver turned successful violence into repeatable ambition. Captives, tribute, and trade connected raiding to wider economies. Winter camps changed the meaning of presence. The Great Army showed that a mobile force could break kingdoms, not only steal from them. Alfred's Wessex survived by turning fear into organization. Normandy showed that a king might grant land to a raider because the raider had become useful to order. Rus showed that river routes, tribute, trade, and religion could fuse into state formation. Cnut showed that a Scandinavian conqueror could sit inside English kingship and make extraction routine. And 1066 showed the final irony. The old Viking world could lose as Harold Hardrada and win as William of Normandy. That is why the ending cannot be simple. The Vikings were not one people moving under one command. They were not only pirates, and they were not only traders. They were not noble freedom lovers outside a corrupt civilization, and they were not mindless destroyers outside history. They were sailors, farmers, chieftains, merchants, warriors, settlers, slavers, mercenaries, kings, converts, husbands, rivals, founders, and opportunists. What made them historically explosive was not purity. It was flexibility. They could move. They could learn. They could become something else. That flexibility changed the regions they entered. In England, Scandinavian settlement left marks in place names, law, language, urban life, political memory, and royal ambition. York, once taken by the Great Army, became a Scandinavian centre before later being absorbed into changing English rule. The Danelaw was not only a military fact, it was a social and legal landscape where communities lived with mixed influence and new boundaries of authority. In Ireland, Viking activity helped shape towns and maritime networks, especially Dublin. The city was tied to trade, craft, warfare, slavery, and settlement. It was not simply a nest of raiders, nor was it an innocent commercial port. It was what many Viking centers were, a place where violence and exchange met so often that they became part of the same urban story. In Normandy, Viking settlement became one of the most consequential acts of absorption in medieval Europe. The descendants of Scandinavian settlers became Christian, French-speaking, aristocratic, and fiercely ambitious. They built a principality strong enough to conquer England, expand into southern Italy and Sicily, and reshape parts of Europe and the Mediterranean. By then, they were no longer Vikings in the old sense, but their political beginnings still carried the memory of a bargain made because raiding had become too costly to ignore. In the East, the Varangian and Rus story shows an even wider transformation. Scandinavian movement through river systems helped connect northern Europe with Byzantium and Islamic silver networks. But the result was not a simple Norse state imposed on empty land. It was a fusion: Norse elites, Slavic and Finnic populations, tribute, trade, local power, religious conversion, and later political memory. The conversion of Kiev under Vladimir in 988 tied Rus authority to the Byzantine Christian world and showed again that durable rule required more than force. Inside Scandinavia, the Viking Age helped make kings. Foreign wealth fed local ambition. Christianization gave rulers a language of legitimacy that European neighbors recognized. Monuments like the Jelling stones turned claims into public memory. Kingship grew through warfare, conversion, tribute, law, and the pressure of rivals. The same societies that had sent ships outward were being reorganized inward. This is why the Viking Age fades rather than simply ends. There is no single day when every raider puts down an axe and becomes a subject of a peaceful kingdom. The old patterns weakened because conditions changed. European defenses improved. Fortified towns, royal organization, naval responses, and political consolidation made raiding more difficult in many regions. Scandinavian rulers became Christian kings with interests in taxation, legitimacy, and dynastic politics. Settlers became locals. Warbands became aristocracies. Trade routes became urban systems. Violence did not vanish, but it became increasingly folded into states, lordships, laws, and claims. A raider could burn a monastery. A ruler had to count the harvest. That difference explains the transformation better than any romantic myth. Imagine a village generations after the first attacks. The people living there may carry names shaped by older Scandinavian settlement. Their market may trade goods along routes once made dangerous by raiders. Their lord may descend from men who first arrived with weapons and later acquired land. Their church may stand on ground that once feared ships. A child grows up not knowing which parts of daily life began as violence, which as compromise, which as survival. That is how conquest becomes normal. Not because the wound was harmless, because time teaches societies how to live around scars. The memory of the Vikings would later be reshaped again and again. Medieval writers often cast them as heathen punishers, enemies of God, agents of terror. Later national histories turned them into founders, explorers, warriors, traders, or ancestors. Modern popular culture gave them helmets they did not wear, personality shaped by fantasy, and a clean identity that the historical world rarely allowed. The real story is darker and more interesting. The Vikings mattered because they revealed that power is not only held by the largest kingdom or the oldest institution. It can begin in mobility, in timing, in the ability to strike where others are slow. But if that power wants to last, it must change shape. It must find food, land, law, allies, children, memory, legitimacy. It must stop being only a moment of fear and become a structure people have to wake up inside. That was the long movement from Lindisfarne to Normandy, from York to Kiev, from Alfred's burrs to Cnut's tax records, from Harold Hardrada's death at Stamford Bridge to William's coronation after Hastings. The first image was a ship coming toward a shore. The final image is harder to see. It is a charter, a coin, a church, a market, a place name, a law code, a royal marriage, a castle rising over an English village, a runestone standing in wind, a silver hoard buried and never recovered, a museum ship resting in silence while visitors admire the beauty of the thing that once made coastlines afraid. The central paradox now has an answer. Europe's destroyers became its rulers because they learned that destruction was only the beginning. The raid could create fear. The camp could create presence. The treaty could create recognition. The baptism could create legitimacy. The tax could create routine. The inheritance could create continuity. And once those pieces came together, the outsider was no longer only outside. He had become part of the system. The Vikings did not conquer Europe by remaining Vikings. They conquered parts of it by becoming something Europe could not remove without removing part of itself. That is the uneasy legacy. The Viking Age left behind towns, roots, dynasties, myths, scars, and identities that outlived the longships as instruments of terror. It forced kingdoms to strengthen. It pushed rulers to organize. It helped create new political cultures in England, Normandy, Scandinavia, and Rus. It also left memories of enslavement, burned communities, broken monasteries, tribute, fear, and lives pulled violently out of their own worlds. Both truths must remain together. To admire the ship without remembering the shore is to make history too clean. To remember only the terror without seeing the transformation is to miss why the Vikings mattered so much. They were not important because they destroyed forever. Many destroyers vanish. They were important because some of them entered the broken spaces they created and learned to rule there. So return one last time to Lindisfarne. The tide is low, the island is exposed. The monks do not yet know what the horizon means. The ships are approaching from a world that Christian Europe has not learned to read. In that first moment, the story looks like a catastrophe moving toward a holy place. But history, with enough time, makes the image stranger. Those ships were not carrying only raiders. They were carrying a future Europe had not yet imagined. If you want the next chapter in this series, tell us which kingdom, dynasty, or empire should face the same kind of autopsy next. Not as legend, not as a list of dates, but as a story of how power is born, how it changes shape, and what it costs the people forced to live beneath it.